Good afternoon to everyone who's just connecting and getting settled. We'll give everyone a couple minutes to join us. We had a few more people on our list this afternoon, and then we'll get started. Thanks for taking the time out of your afternoon. All right, we'll give everyone a minute here to settle in and see if a few folks are able to join us, but we'll get started shortly. All right, it looks like we do have hopefully a few more people joining us this afternoon, but we can certainly start with just some introductions and housekeeping items as they trickle in before we jump into the bulk of the presentation. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this public open house for the Township of King Rural Zoning Bylaw Review. My name is Matt Rodriguez. I'm a consultant planner at WSP, the consulting firm working with the Township on this project, and we're really excited to be here today to present and introduce the draft of the new zoning bylaw for the countryside. So just before we begin, you might have received a notice or a little notification when you joined, but this meeting is being recorded, and we will be posting a recording of the meeting on the Township speaking webpage in the coming days, so you'll be able to review it at your leisure and your own pace. We do ask that you remain on mute until the Q&A period. And at any time, feel free to pop your questions or comments in the chat box, and we'll save those until the end and get through those in the order they come in. As well, you can feel free to raise your hand as well once we get to the Q&A session, and we'll work through all those questions as well. When using the chat box, just be sure that the everyone option is selected so that I can see it and the rest of the attendees can see it, and help us keep the conversation moving along. So before we get into the presentation, I briefly introduce myself. My name is Matt Rodriguez, the project planner at WSP, and I'll pass it over to Kristen Harrison at the Township to introduce the Township and Council.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Kristen Harrison, the policy planner with King Township, and I know Stephen Naylor is also the director of growth management services and may be on the call today as well. And we also have from Council this afternoon, I see Avia Eek. So thank you, Councillor Eek, for joining us. And Matt, I'll turn it back over to you. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us and for your participation.
Great, thank you so much, Kristen. Just making sure I don't have any other folks in the waiting room before we get started. Okay, so just a quick agenda, quick overview of our presentation. We'll give a bit of a background on the project, its purpose, what we've done to date, and how we've gotten here. For those who are new to the project or maybe just learning about it now, we'll give a brief overview of what a zoning bylaw does and what it is. Then we'll go over the process of how we shaped the zoning bylaw and sort of explain the steps that we took. We'll also introduce the key sections and key changes of the rural zoning bylaw and go through each section of that accordingly. And then we'll wrap up with the open Q&A period. Feel free to, as I said, mention or drop your comments in the chat box or raise your hand at that point. And then we'll just go into some next steps in the project. So we're really excited to be here today because this means we've now published and released the draft zoning bylaw for the countryside. And we're here today to present that and to introduce it to you and to the rest of the community. This is the second public open house that we've held. We held one back in July. As well, there was an introduction video posted on the Township's webpage when it was released. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to take a look at the bylaw and get up to speed. My computer is automatically changing slides. All right. So in today's public open house, as I mentioned, we'll walk through the draft zoning bylaw for the countryside and highlight those key changes that are proposed. We'll summarize how your feedback and input has shaped the proposed bylaw. This is certainly not the first or the last consultation opportunity for the community. We'll outline how you can view the updated zone mapping and how it applies to your property. And then we'll share how you can provide comments and get involved going forward. So the township's rural area is currently regulated by zoning bylaw 7453, and that covers all of those lands that are shaded yellow on the image on the right-hand side of your screen. And that covers the hamlets, the rural area, so farmland and other rural lands, as well as the prime agricultural areas. The purpose of this project is to really review and update that bylaw as it was first introduced in 1974, and also to implement the township's new official plan and introduce modern standards and address key issues and opportunities that we first identified in a discussion paper that was prepared and released near the end of 2020. So in terms of the role of a zoning bylaw, it establishes provisions that regulate the use of land and such things as the size, height, location, and location of buildings and structures within the township. And so on this image on the right, you can see maybe some of the areas that it regulates: setbacks, lot sizes and widths, lot coverage. Maybe you wanted to build a deck or a shed on your property. There may be rules that apply to you in those cases. Permitted uses, so what is actually permitted on a piece of land to be built. Also looking at things like building height and massing and where a building is on the lot. The bylaw also divides the township into various zones, and that we'll go through what those zones mean and in going forward. Bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to make sure that my computer stops changing slides on me. There we go. I think I know why. Okay. Great. So just a quick overview of the process. So we're right now in phase 2, which is signified by this sort of green circle in the middle of your screen. Phase 1 of the project involved us preparing a draft and final discussion paper, and we did that over the course of 2020. At the end of 2020 in December, we had a few public open houses to introduce the project and get your input and feedback on that discussion paper and those preliminary issues to look at. We also updated the project website, which has been maintained sort of throughout the project. And we went to council with a presentation to sort of formally introduce the project and seek their input. As I mentioned, we're now in phase 2 and just about to wrap it up with this open house and then head into phase 3. Phase 2 has involved a couple more workshops to talk about specific topics such as hamlets and agricultural zoning, some public open houses, project website updates, and some stakeholder meetings. Phase 3 will start, or has started in some ways, but will start in earnest in the fall, and we'll be looking to finalize the draft zoning bylaw for the countryside ahead of the statutory public meeting, and then eventually council's adoption of the bylaw. So the zoning bylaw hasn't been prepared, in isolation or in a silo. It's really been informed by a number of steps along the way. As I mentioned, we prepared a zoning discussion paper in the fall of 2020. That led to some public open houses in December 2020, where we talked about those recommendations, those issues and opportunities, and sought your feedback and input. Then we dialed in on some more specific issues at those zoning workshops that I mentioned, including hamlets and agricultural areas. And then we had some one-on-one stakeholder meetings with Township Council and staff and other stakeholders in the community. And so, it's been a comprehensive project to get there, and it's been really informed by public and stakeholder input. All right, now for the exciting stuff. So we're here to walk through each section of the zoning bylaw. And so the zoning bylaw is structured across 9, kind of 10 key sections that we'll walk through sort of one by one and explain some of the key changes that we've introduced in those sections. So when you first open the bylaw, you'll see what's called the preamble section. And the preamble section really serves as a user guide to help readers understand how to read and interpret the zoning bylaw. So if this is your first time looking at a zoning bylaw, or even the 50th time, we encourage you to take a look at the preamble to really understand, what maps apply to your property, how to maybe understand the zoning on your lands. It also explains how to check what zoning applies, and sort of a bit of a user guide. Jumping into part 1 of the draft zoning bylaw is the administration section, and this formally establishes where the zoning bylaw applies in King Township. It outlines how the zoning bylaw is to be read and interpreted. So it provides that framework for people to say, if you're reading a provision, how it applies to your property, and some of the interpretation provisions around that. A key element of this section is transition provisions, and what this does is it allows provisions to transition between the old or the current bylaw and the new bylaw, so that if there's an application in process, that there is some ability there for it to continue under the framework that it was submitted within. Jumping into section 2 is the definitions section of the bylaw. And this section defines keywords and terms used in the bylaw to assist with interpretation and applicability. And so you'll see it's essentially a glossary of key terms. When you go through the bylaw and you're looking at the permitted uses, all permitted uses in the bylaw are defined to make it easier to use and understand. So in the current bylaw, not all of the permitted uses are defined. So you might look at something and say, what does that even mean? Or is this actually what I'm proposing or what's on my property? And you might not be 100% clear. So we've tried to make it very clear about what those permitted uses are. When you're reading through the bylaw as well, defined terms are italicized to support interpretation, to really know, okay, this is a defined term. If I need a bit more clarity, I can go to the definition section to seek a definition there. And so again, that's a key change from the old bylaw, and similar to the urban bylaws for King City, Nobleton, and Schaumburg that you will see. On to section, or part 3 rather, is the general provisions section. General provisions are these general zoning regulations that apply perhaps to specific uses or to all properties within the township. And those have been comprehensively reviewed from bylaw 7453. We've also taken this opportunity to modernize and update general provisions where appropriate, and to make sure they're contemporary and up to date. We've also introduced many new general provisions for uses such as additional residential units. So those are sometimes called second suites or maybe an accessory apartment, to make it very clear about what the permissions are in accordance with the township's official plan. And we've also introduced a framework for on-farm diversified uses, which are those secondary uses that are on a farm that are secondary to the main agricultural use. And we've also considered provisions for both seasonal and permanent farm help dwellings. And so lots of key changes to this section, and we encourage you to explore it, again, as it relates to maybe your property or something of interest to you. Part 4 of the bylaw covers parking and loading standards. And so these are, requirements for parking spaces and loading spaces, which is, for example, a truck delivery or a space for commercial uses to have that truck come in and park and load and unload. Again, we've done a comprehensive review of the parking standards and brought it all together. Each permitted use has an associated parking standard with it. So for example, if you wanted to build a restaurant, there would be an associated parking rate for that restaurant and all the other uses on that property. Those parking standards are organized by different use categories. So you'll see all the residential uses together, the commercial uses together, and they align with the other parts of the bylaw. We've also introduced some new requirements for bicycle parking racks for certain rural uses to really support a cycling-friendly community. So if you want to ride out to maybe an on-farm brewery or a little cafe out in the rural area, if someone's building a new facility, there would be that opportunity or requirement to add some bicycle parking racks to support that tourism opportunity and get around town a little bit easier. So part 5 is sort of the segue into the main zoning sections. And so what this section does is it provides a description and a classification of all of the zones and zone maps. So it establishes and describes the different zones that apply throughout the countryside. So what the name of the zone is, what the zone code is, and maybe what the purpose is. It also provides an overview on how to read and interpret the zone maps. So if you're not sure about, how to read the map, or you're not sure what zoning applies to your property, this section provides a little bit more detail in addition to the other sections. We've also, alongside the release of this bylaw, released zone maps in both PDF and interactive formats. So PDF is handy if you wanted to download it and print a section or view it in a different format. Interactive is great if you want to zoom in and navigate the whole township and really see all the zoning that applies around. All right. So jumping into part 6 is the first zone chapter, I guess, so to speak, and it covers the hamlet zones. And so we've heard a number of comments from the public open houses, from the workshops, and from staff and community members about the hamlets. And so we really wanted to show what we heard and then what we did in those zone chapters. So the first thing that we heard is that the built form and function of the hamlets is unique within the township. And so in order to recognize that, we've established new hamlet residential zones to recognize that unique hamlet character. We also heard that it's important to implement the policies and land use designations of the township's official plan. So the township's official plan establishes those land use designations and those policies that the zoning bylaw must conform to. And so there's some changes in the hamlets that we've had to address, and we've heard from the community on those. And to that end, in this section, the new hamlet zones have been proposed to implement the new official plan. And so when you view that zone mapping, you'll see how it's been applied and how that aligns with the township's official plan designations. Looking into part 7 of the bylaw, the rural and agricultural zones, this section covers the broad, some broad areas, the prime agricultural lands, some of those rural lands. We heard it was really important to be clear about what is considered an on-farm diversified use. And so the bylaw identifies very specific types of on-farm diversified uses, such as agritourism or a farm, microbrewery, cidery, winery. And what that allows us to do is provide some specificity to the township when they're looking at different applications in terms of what constitutes an on-farm diversified use. Our approach also allows the opportunity potentially for a minor variance or zoning bylaw amendment if a use isn't contemplated within that framework. But on-farm diversified uses generally are contemplated within these zones, and there is a framework and general provisions, as I mentioned earlier, for those. We also heard it was important to direct agricultural related uses away from prime agricultural lands. So agricultural related uses are those farm, industrial, or commercial uses, like a feed mill or fertilizer station, I guess, that really support the agricultural community, but don't necessarily need to be on the same lot as a farm. And so we want to be very clear about where those are permitted or not permitted and establish a framework for those. And so through the bylaw in this section, we established a framework for agriculture related uses for future planning applications. And so should you be interested in building a new one, there would be a process to go through in terms of zoning bylaw amendment in order to apply some of the new zones that we've established in this section. Another key thing that we heard in the rural and agricultural zone realm, I guess, is that it's important to maintain existing environmental protections. When you're driving through the countryside and you're driving around farms, obviously there's the farm fields, but you'll also see woodlots and other, important natural features that are part of the rural area and contribute to the character, the sustainability, and the viability of the township. And so in order to address that and also to implement the township's policies in the official plan, we've introduced a new agricultural greenbelt zone to implement the policies of the provincial greenbelt plan for the natural heritage system. And so when you see in the bylaw, you'll see a new agricultural greenbelt zone, and that applies to a number of properties within the township and really helps implement the township's official plan. Again, that's a key objective of this project, to implement the policies of the official plan, and also in this case, to maintain those existing environmental protections that are in place. We also heard one of the things that we came out of actually one of the agricultural workshops that we conducted with stakeholders is that we needed to review the framework for farm help dwellings. And so farm help dwellings are those uses that say you're a farm operator and you have some seasonal staff, perhaps a place for them to live, or you have them year round and you need a bit of additional living space on your property. There's also a number of lessons that we might have learned from COVID-19 in terms of on-farm help living conditions and how we can, how a zoning bylaw can help improve those conditions for workers, in terms of living space and, making it a bit better and perhaps a bit safer. So in the bylaw, we distinguish between two types of farm help dwellings: permanent, so year-round, and seasonal, typically operating between May-ish and October-ish. And in that regard, seasonal farm help dwellings are permitted in two zones, the AS and AG zones, which generally aligns with the Holland Marsh. But permanent farm help dwellings, which would be on a lot on a permanent basis, would be subject to a site-specific zoning bylaw amendment. And that would allow township staff and council to really weigh in on the location of the structure, the size, the living area, and to have that a bit more control over where it is and the conditions. But the seasonal ones, we've introduced a framework that they are permitted in certain zones. So that covers the rural and agricultural section, but we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the Oak Ridges Moraine zones. And so a huge swath of King Township is covered by the Oak Ridges Moraine Plan. And so it's really important that we cover off those policies, which is a provincial plan, and then carried forward into the township's official plan through the zoning bylaw. So Part 8 establishes those Oak Ridges Moraine zones. We've carried forward the township's existing Oak Ridges Moraine zoning bylaw in for the most part, which was completed in 2005. We've also reviewed it to make sure it conforms to the township's current official plan, which was completed in 2020, and the most recent iteration of the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan. The zone names are generally the same, but we've shortened up the zone symbols to make them a little bit more streamlined and just to align with how the other structures of the zones. And so, there shouldn't be too many surprises on the Oak Ridges Moraine side, but certainly an important part of this bylaw. Part 9 covers the other zones, and so there's the environmental protection zone, and we've carried forward an important part of this bylaw is we carried forward the existing environmental protection zone boundaries. So we haven't reduced, any environmental protections, but we also haven't necessarily added within the EP zone specifically, haven't added lands to that zone. We've also introduced a new major recreational zone, and so that's to be applied through future development applications. And so that covers off things like golf courses and maybe some other outdoor recreational amenities. And this, again, is just another tool for township staff to be able to review applications against and set a bit of a framework and expectations going forward. Bear with me 1 second while I just check out our waiting room here. Hello to everyone who's just joined us. We're just in the presentation and we appreciate you taking the time this afternoon. And so now we want to just provide a brief overview of the different maps and the different schedules that make up the township's zoning bylaw for the countryside. And so these maps really show which regulations apply to your property. So you might be reading the bylaw and it says, so-and-so shown on Schedule C2. And so then you look to Schedule C2 to understand what applies to your property. So Schedule A at a high level shows those zones that are established in Part 5. So that when you look at Schedule A, you'll know whether your property is zoned in the hamlets or Oak Ridges Moraine or in an agricultural zone, for example. Schedule B schedules identify further regulations that apply to properties. So those cover topics like wellhead protection areas and prime agricultural areas. So something else. So once you know what zone applies to property, then you look to Schedule B for those further regulations. Looking towards Schedule C, it applies some very specific regulations for the Oak Ridges Moraine. And so when you're in the ORM zones, you look to those to understand, again, what are those other constraints on the property that you need to be aware of when you're considering any development. So that covers areas of influence, landform conservation areas, areas of high aquifer vulnerability, and wellhead protection area. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, there's two options to view the zone mapping. The first option is to view it in PDF form. And so you can download it, print it, mark it up. And so that's for sort of the static version. We also have an interactive map. And so what's really cool about the interactive map is if you do check it out, you can search by address. You can search any address in the township and it'll show the zoning in the rural area. You can also leave a comment. And so if you're thinking, you look at your property and you think, well, this isn't what I wanted, or this isn't what I expected, or what does this even mean? You can leave a comment for the project team, and we'll see that as we go to finalize the bylaw. The link to the interactive map, as well as the PDF mapping, is available on the Township speaking page. As I said, you can search by address and then click on a property to leave a comment. And so we hope that both options work for different people, and you're able to check out what zoning applies to your property. Oh, that changed right on time. I still haven't been able to turn off the automatic slide switch here, so getting ahead of myself. Looking towards next steps and refinement. So as I mentioned, the draft zoning bylaw for the countryside is now available, and we are welcoming your comments on that until the end of next week. If you do need a couple more days, we can certainly accommodate that, but we would look for comments by August 18th where possible for us to consider where edits to the bylaw going forward. As I mentioned, we, based on those edits from township staff, council, and other edits that we've caught along the way, we'll prepare the next iteration, so to speak, of the bylaw. And what's key to that next section of the bylaw that might be missing from the current iteration are the site-specific amendments. And so we'll, in addition to considering all the comments received on the draft bylaw, we'll be adding those site-specific amendments to the new bylaw into the new format and into the mapping, and they'll be reviewed and incorporated where appropriate. So if you're looking at your property and you're thinking, hey, I had a site-specific on my property, where the heck is it? It's coming. And so we look forward to releasing that in the next iteration, and certainly another opportunity to provide comments on that. Once that's all done and we have that final draft of the zoning bylaw, we'll look to release that in the fall, for further comment. We'll have a couple more opportunities for consultation, and then we'll go to that statutory public meeting. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentation. We wanted to provide that overview of the project, really just sort of explain the process and what's coming up. And so now we're up, we'll open up the floor. I've already seen one hand go up, which is great. Happy to take any questions in the chat box, or pop your hand up as well. And we'll do that. Again, just a reminder that the meeting is being recorded, and feel free to unmute yourself once called upon. Chat box is open as well, and then we'll download that at the end so we have a record of the comments received. And again, just remember to use the everyone option when entering your questions so that we can all benefit and see what you are asking. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so the presentation stops scrolling on us, and then we'll come back in a little bit and just go over some next steps in a bit more detail and how to provide your feedback. So bear with me 1 second here. All right, so we're all back together here. Jennifer, would you like to kick it off perhaps with your question or comment?
Yes, hi, thank you. So I was going through, and I think it's the most recent version, although I have a hard time figuring out what it is, but the one that I'm looking at, there's a 4 places where it says note to draft to be completed in a future version. I'm looking at, for right now, example, the Hamlet zone exceptions. Yep. But in your previous remarks, you'd said that, the next version is going to be the final version. At what point do we get to read that before it's final?
Great question. So what we're working on right now actually is cleaning up all those exceptions, getting them into a consistent template similar to the urban bylaws if you've seen them. And those will be put into the next iteration of the bylaw, and then we'll have consultation on it before the final one. And so
okay, so there's like a third.
There's like step. Yes, there will be an opportunity before adoption for sure to comment on it, as we go forward in the process. So stay tuned for that in the fall.
Okay, I've got some other questions while I'm here.
Yeah.
And you'll have to excuse me, I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing yet, and so it's possible that these answers are right there now, and it's a massive document, as I'm sure you can appreciate. Okay, so
I've looked at it, yeah.
From a June note I had made was, hold on, that's part of the, never mind, okay, hold on, bear with me, there's like a list.
And if you need to follow up afterwards, like
yeah,
by
you
email,
know what?
let us, happy to come back to you, or you can follow up by email if it's easier. If you want to take a look at things, happy to do that.
Okay, I'm gonna take my hand down, let somebody else up the floor, and I'll just read my notes and come back if I have more questions. Thank you.
No, for sure. Thank you. Deborah, any questions or comments?
Oh. Hi, yeah, just about Nobleton and the Nobleton Reserve area.
Sure.
I've noticed that it is sort of blending in with, it's really kind of being treated as if it's an agricultural area. Just wondering if you've given any consideration to a special category for those lands, given that they're not within a hamlet, they're not within a rural area, and they're not within a countryside area. I know that the other Nobleton zoning bylaw didn't deal with the land, so they're kind of out there floating. But I do, just thinking ahead, that these are lands designated in the official plan as a reserve area, and that maybe it should be given special consideration to think a little bit about, you know, if we're encouraging a full range of agricultural uses, what that might mean in the future when those lands do get built out, and kind of creating a conflicting land use, you know, where now you've got to put buffers in and now you're sterilizing lands and that kind of thing. So I noticed that you had talked a little bit about the agricultural related uses, like things like that might be a good alternative where, you know, kind of a placeholder that makes sense, but that could be a little bit more compatible with growth in the future.
I'll just maybe start by saying, you know, it's not something we've specifically considered in terms of a unique zone category or any specific provisions for the urban reserve. Kristen, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that from a BOP perspective or otherwise.
Thanks, and thanks, Deborah, for bringing that up. That's a good point. It's well received, and we'll take that back and consider it a little bit further and see if there's any changes that might be needed there.
Okay.
Because yes, the Nobleton Reserve is a little bit different than our typical, a little bit. It's definitely different than our typical agricultural area. I think the OP still does encourage agricultural uses to continue on those lands at this time. So we don't want to take away any of those agricultural permissions, but perhaps highlighting those lands just to recognize that they are within a village boundary is a good point. So we'll take that back.
Okay. I'll probably make a submission on that kind of vein, but yeah, just wanted to point it out. Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you.
Really helpful. Thanks, Deborah. Any other comments or questions from anyone else who's been able to join us? Jennifer's back. She's got her comments.
Hi, okay. Yeah, so there was two questions that I had. One had to do with the hamlet character. I don't immediately see how you identify different types of residential zones, like how different hamlets have different characteristics. Thanks.
Yeah, I can certainly provide a bit of context in that. So we, you know, as I said, we did the workshop where we, as part of that workshop, and the slides are available online as well if you want to take a look at those after, just in terms of some more visuals, and there's some good graphics there, where our team actually characterized the existing character in the hamlets. So we wanted to understand, you know, the predominant setbacks and different height characteristics, and we did a bit of quantitative analysis actually, or a bit of a desktop review, I guess, is a better term, and just to understand those character elements, and then applied that based on that desktop exercise to some of those different parcels within the hamlets. In addition, we've also needed to conform obviously to the official plan. So there has been some changes to some of the zoning, the zoning of some of the parcels in the hamlets in order to implement that policy.
Okay, what's the title of that document? I should go look for it.
I'm not ignoring you. I'm going to look up at my upper screen here and I'll get a link and I will pop it in the chat box.
Oh, fabulous.
So that we can get that, you can take that away.
Okay, and the other comment I had was that regarding the secondary residential units. So I note that I'm just going to read from my notes here. I note from that the definition of a rural residential is a lot frontage of 120 meters, and rural estate residential is 60 meters. how'd you get to those numbers? And the reason why it occurs to me is that my neighbor has a bit of a funny lot. Not that I'm picking on her. It just immediately came to my mind. She's very wide, but very shallow. So if she decided that she wanted to put up a second unit, technically she would conform with this thing, but because she's so shallow, it really wouldn't work. I
think I'm going to need to take that away, but I think that's an interesting comment just in terms of, you know, the situation of the lot and, you know, that frontage versus depth, you know, ratio. Yeah, that's an interesting comment taken, and we'll certainly look at that and, you know, understand what potentially some of the development ramifications are of changing that. So I'm just gonna, sorry, I'm also just taking a couple quick notes here, so apologies if I look up. And actually, I just took a quick look at the speaking page, and Kristen, actually, maybe I spoke incorrectly. The Hamlet slides might not be up there, and perhaps we could follow up afterwards.
Yeah, I can follow up afterwards on that one with you.
Okay, thanks.
Kristen.
Sorry, Jennifer. Okay, no, thanks for that comment. I do appreciate it, and we'll take a look at that.
That's all. Thanks so much.
Great. Okay, so Harry popped he indicated his interest in chatting or speaking in the chat box first. So Harry, why don't you share your comments or questions?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for an excellent presentation. I just had a couple of questions for clarification. On the on-farm diversified uses, they are noted as being a secondary use in the A and the AG zones. And I know there are some restrictions on the size, but it says that it shall not exceed a combined total of 1 hectare or 2% of the lot area. Is there any consideration to limit the size of an individual use, similar to what you've done with the home industries?
So you're saying instead of the use in like the uses in aggregate being each individual use?
Well, you could have the aggregate, but at the same time, I think you want to avoid a situation where one use takes up the entire, let's say 1 hectare, 10,000 square meters. Does that become secondary when it can typically take up that whole area?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can provide a bit of context in, you know, how we arrived at those numbers. I mean, we looked at to other jurisdictions in terms of, you know, what I guess best and promising practices are in terms of that number. I think, you know, that the flexibility to say in aggregate, you know, that it's the sum of, just allows a bit of flexibility for owners to have, you know, maybe the on-farm cafe and an agritourism use, for example, and that it's one space. But something we can take away is, you know, maybe that's not 100% suitable for, you know, maybe we don't want a 1 hectare, you know, cafe. Right. And so, you know, maybe we can, you know, take a look at that for specific uses, but perhaps a 1 hectare agritourism use, which, you know, has some outdoor amenities and stuff like that, you know, maybe that's okay to be 1 hectare. So certainly something we can consider. I think, you know, some of the nuance there of the minimum size.
Yeah, I was thinking more along the lines of the cafe and the studio. That probably that's not an appropriate size for, but technically the way it's written, you could assume that would be better, right?
Look at, again, just taking a couple quick notes here, so apologies for a quick pause there. Shop, etc. Great, thanks so much, Harry. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I just had one. Similarly with the open storage, I know that's also listed as an accessory use within the A zones, but I think there was also a clause in there that subsection H, which says open storage areas shall not exceed 50% of the lot area. And then 2 subsections below that, it says the provisions of subsections B through A shall not apply within an agricultural zone. So does that mean that up to 100% of the lot can be covered by an open storage? Because I think in that situation, I'd be concerned that it's not an accessory anymore if it exceeds the 50% within the agricultural zone, if it is intended to be accessory.
I'm gonna have to. I don't want to misspeak on that, so I'm gonna take a comment on that for sure, and we'll take a look at what that looks like.
Okay. Yeah, and we will be providing some comments on behalf of our client, but that, I just
Okay.
wanted some clarification on that, just so it informs my my letter to you guys.
For sure. Yeah, no, duly, comment taken for sure on the on-farm diversified uses, something we can look at. I mean, you know, what's kind of good or nice about, you know, how the provincial framework is set up is that there is flexibility for municipalities to define that secondary, you know, and what that means. So certainly something we can look at. And again, we'll look at the open storage, you know, ratios and rates just to, again, make sure that, you know, see if they're appropriate.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Harry. Just in the chat box, there's a comment here from Ian wondering what the difference is between Landform Conservation Area 1 and 2 on which are shown on Schedule C2. And without getting too much into the details here, Section 8.4.3 of the zoning bylaw, which is within the Oak Ridges Moraine Zones, spells out in pretty good detail what each of the categories are and what provisions apply. And so it distinguishes between Category 1 and Category 2. And again, for the benefit of the group, actually, I'll pop a link to the speaking page in the chat box and you can take a look there. But fundamentally, you know, Category 1 are, you know, those areas of impervious surface where there's a limitation on there's a limitation on the amount of impervious surface that can happen on a lot, and it's a bit higher in Category 2, and so it really regulates what that impervious surface is on those lots. But some more details for sure, check out Section 8.4.3. Okay, Nils, hopefully got that correct. Feel free to hop off mute and ask a question or comment.
Thank you. I just had a question regarding Oak Ridges Moraine. That seems to be still a prominent piece in the plan. I apologize, I haven't been able to have time to read through it. I'm going to be doing that. And it seems to be still a very important piece. So I'm wondering, is it the same as current protection of the Oak Ridges Moraine? Is it more protection and so forth? There are some, you know, if you look at the north end of Nobleton, which does have a lot of Oak Ridges Moraine through it, there's proposed subdivision in the corner of 15th and 27. That's going to have a huge impact on Nobleton and the area around it there with cars and traffic. And I'm wondering, is this now protecting that sort of development to happen and to protect the environment better, or is it stuff like that still allowed to happen?
I might kick that off just saying that for the most part, we've carried forward the existing Oak Ridges Moraine protections. There's been some minor adjustments and just making sure that we're conforming to the township's official plan. But I may pass it, Kristen, I don't know if you wanted to provide any comments on that development or just in terms of changes in that area.
Yeah, and so we have carried forward the protections of the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan for the lands within the Oak Ridges Moraine. And really the bylaw that was produced in 2005 for the moraine has been updated in this bylaw to address changes that were made to the provincial plan in 2017. It also, it carries forward protections for like the landform conservation area that were just mentioned, the wellhead protection areas. So very much still an environmentally protective zoning bylaw. And then in terms of the development at the corner of the 15th and 27th, that's actually, those lands are within the settlement boundary of Nobleton. So they have a different official, or a different part of the official plan applies. They're within a village and development is permitted within villages in the Oak Ridges Moraine. So there's a different section of the Oak Ridges Moraine plan that applies. Whereas out in the countryside or the rural area that we're talking about here, development permissions are very different. So the moraine plan says you're going to grow in your villages and that's okay, but out in the countryside area, there's not going to be the same level of development. You can have your existing single detached dwelling and accessory uses there too, your agricultural uses, but none of that form of development that you would see within a village. So I hope that answers your question. Did you have any follow-up?
No, it does explain it. So I don't think that corner is in the current hamlet. I think maybe it's more of the expanded area of Nobleton. But you're saying that is then part of that area that's allowed to be developed.
Yeah, sorry, and I may have misspoke there. There's an area around Nobleton known as the Nobleton Village Reserve that isn't designated for growth at this time, but there is some lands right at the southeast corner of Highway 27 and 15th that are within the urban area of Nobleton that there is permissions for development.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Kristen, and thanks for the question, Nils. Not seeing any other hands up. There was a question in the chat box from Lisa here asking about open storage within the agricultural greenbelt zone. And so, as I mentioned when we walked through the presentation, the agricultural greenbelt zone is really intended to implement the policies of the official plan, and speaking to the official plan, it really does look at, maintaining the compatibility and maintaining that natural setting and maintaining the, intent of that, and also speaking to, minimum developable or maximum developable areas on certain lots. And so I believe our intention of not including open storage was just to help maintain some of that natural setting and avoid large swaths of open storage in those sort of natural areas, but certainly something we can take a look at as we go through the bylaw again with the fine-tooth comb and understand whether that's appropriate or not. Okay, thanks, Lisa. Another question here for Ian around some of the nomenclature. Great question. And so Ian's question was just wondering what some of the acronyms and what some of the notations stand for that you might see on the map. So if you're on the interactive map, which I will navigate to now as well, it should in the legend area give you the description of what that acronym stands for. If it doesn't, we'll certainly look into that. But if you go to the bylaw as well in part 5, it says what the zone name is, what the symbol is, and what the description is. So just for the benefit of the discussion, ORC is Oak Ridges Moraine Countryside. ORF is Oak Ridges Moraine Feature Protection. ORL is Oak Ridges Moraine Natural Core and Linkage. And ORA is Oak Ridges Moraine Aggregate. And so again, it's just sort of a shorthand for those that you'll see on the property. Bear with me 1 second here. Yeah, so if you click on, if you've navigated to the interactive map and you click on the left, you'll see like some different symbols, and one should be a legend. And if you click the legend button, you should be able to see the name and the zone symbol for each property, and it spells out what each of them means as well. Great. Oh, Ian found it. Perfect. Yeah, someone just messaged as well, just wondering if there's an opportunity to follow up via email. Yes. So in a second, I'll share my screen again momentarily, and I'll provide that email for the benefit of the group, and I can pop Kristen's email in the chat box if you want to follow up afterwards. Again, we'd welcome the comments, ideally within the next week or so, just to give us that time to be able to take those away, really reflect on them, and consider them in the next bylaw. Great, Kristen popped it in there already. So it's kharrison@king.ca, and you can send any comments there to her, and we'll get those as well at the project team. So not seeing any comments right now, and certainly not closing it off. I'll just go over to our sort of last slide here, just to go over that next steps. And judging by the group so far today, I think everyone will be interested in sort of understanding the timing of next steps here. So hopefully you're seeing my screen again. Yes, Kristen? Looks good, okay. Just want to make sure you're not seeing something weird. And so again, you're invited to provide your questions and provide feedback on the draft bylaw. On the speaking web page, there's an opportunity to provide your comments there, or by contacting Township staff. And Kristen's contact information is in the blue box on the right-hand side of your screen. And the link to the speaking page is in the chat box and also on the screen as well. Again, we ask for your comments ideally by August 18th to give us that opportunity to reflect and consider them in the next iteration. But perhaps let us know if you expect comments later than that, and we can certainly look to understand what the timing is there. As I said, we'll certainly accept comments after that. We're not going to disregard them, but they may not be considered in this iteration. But as I said previously, there will be sort of that interim, another iteration final before going to council for adoption. Comments and input received at and following the statutory public meeting, which will be held later in the fall, will be considered as part of the final zoning bylaw for the countryside. So certainly more opportunities to get involved. And as I mentioned earlier, we're hoping to have a bit more public and stakeholder consultation in September and October on that next iteration of the bylaw, to including the site-specific exceptions, to get those comments from everyone. So that's sort of the next steps in terms of the process, and perhaps some important contact information. This brings us, I guess, to the formal conclusion of the presentation. But we certainly have time left in the session, and would welcome any more discussion, comments, questions, quandaries, and happy to continue the discussion. Okay. Not seeing, just take a look at the chat box really quickly. Great, so Kristen's popped her email in the chat box as well, if you'd like to copy that for your records. It's also on the speaking page as your central resource there. A question or comment from Mohammed?
Hey, so I'm actually in touch with Christian, so I do appreciate you guys scheduling this meeting, but I just have a question in terms of zoning. So I'm new to the whole process, and actually someone earlier was talking about intersection 15 side road and highway 27, and I'm basically between two different bylaws, which is the Aquamarine and another one, and I want to know, in certain situation, what makes someone under two different bylaws.
Sorry, can you just clarify that the operative piece of your question there? So like they're between.
Yeah, so in terms of bylaws, when you're under two restrictions, like are there any capabilities or any way where you basically lie under one restriction or one bylaw instead of being under two?
Kristen, do you know the property that he's speaking about by chance?
Yeah, and so in that instance, we have our parent bylaw, which is bylaw 7453, and it was amended back in 2005 with the Oak Ridges Marine Conformity Bylaw. And so the Marine Conformity Bylaw it's required by the province that we had to do that bylaw. And it really brought the township's zoning into conformity with the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan at that time. And so we still have that requirement moving forward. With this bylaw will have to be in conformity with the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan, the 2017 version of that Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan. So in this instance, you'll be once we establish this new bylaw, it will just be one bylaw. Well, that's what we're anticipating at this time, that it will be one bylaw, and it will incorporate the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan provisions into this bylaw. So instead of having to refer to two bylaws, like you have had to in the past, it'll just all be under one house, one roof.
One-stop shop.
And basically the Oak Ridge Marine will take perspective that that's the bylaw that we will be following, correct?
Yes, so if the property is subject to the Oak Ridges Marine, there is sometimes opportunities to carry forward site-specific exceptions, but we have to review those to make sure that they're still conforming with the Oak Ridges Marine conservation plan. So if you had a commercial zone in the past, sometimes it's not appropriate to continue to recognize that, but in some instances, if you had previous zoning that allowed for us to continue to consider that use on the property, then there may be an opportunity to carry that forward, but we have to review that on kind of a case-by-case basis to make sure that they're all conforming with the provincial policy.
Fair enough. Well, I guess I'll work with you on this. I just wanted to get a little bit understanding or what are the cases that you're under 2 bylaws, and I guess that will be resolved moving forward.
Yes, yes, it'll be administered, an improvement on the administration for sure of the bylaw.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, certainly a key objective of this project is to make it easier for the public, landowners, stakeholders, developers, and staff to be able to, look at one document or one map and understand, exactly what applies to their property. So hopefully some of that clarification comes with the new bylaw. Any other questions or comments? Respecting people's time, I guess the presentation is formally concluded, but we'll certainly stick on to answer any questions that you have. And we really appreciate you taking the time. Again, a recording of the session will be posted on the speaking page, which is the Township's project webpage. And so you can review it or play it back at a later time and date. And certainly welcoming comments via email or otherwise as we continue forward with this project. So we really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon, and hope your Augusts are going really well. So as I said, we'll stay here. We're not going anywhere, but respecting everyone's time, we'll formally conclude the presentation. And as I said, thanks for joining us this afternoon. A question maybe in the chat box here from Ian. Kristen, perhaps you might be able to shed some light on that. Might be something we need to take away.
The ORL, would that be the Oak Ridges Moraine Natural Linkage?
Yes.
Linkage?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if the provincial, the province identifies where the Oak Ridges Moraine natural core and natural linkage areas are, as well as where the Oak Ridges Moraine countryside areas are in the provincial plan, and so our official plan carries those forward, as well as the zoning bylaw. So the Oak Ridges Moraine countryside would apply up in the, I see that you've noted Dufferin and 18th Dufferin between 18th and 19th versus the ORL between Kettleby Road and 19th. So it really just comes, the reason why they're different in those areas is because of the provincial designations, and the natural core and linkage areas really recognize where there are significant environmental features or linkages between those features. And then the countryside area is really a supporting area that supports the natural core and natural linkage areas, and provides for a little bit more flexibility in the land use or the permitted uses in that area. But the natural core and linkage areas are very restrictive in terms of what's permitted. I hope that answers the question. And if not, Ian, feel free to come off mute and let me know.
And thanks to Councillor Eek for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate you being a supporter of this project. And perhaps a follow-up question here from Nils, just wondering, so when a property is divided by ORMC and RU1, what applies? So there's a number of properties because of the Oak Ridges Moraine in the township that are what are called split zone. So you have, your square lot, and maybe there's a irregular line that splits it in half. And so you'd have the front portion be RU1 and the back portion be ORMC. And so that zone applies to each part of the lot. And so when you have it in, so when a property is divided, that zone applies to each portion of the lot. And so, it's important that, any development or anything that's happening on that lot, reflects the regulations that apply to each section of that property. Perhaps a follow-up question here from Rosemary, just noting about site-specific amendments being reviewed and incorporated. What about legal non-conforming uses? So, we'll be introducing provisions within the bylaw, obviously to recognize legal non-conforming uses and legal non-complying uses. And so those sections are in the bylaw currently. As well, as we said, we'll be looking at those site-specific exceptions and understanding their applicability going forward. But we do expect that most, the lion's share of those exceptions will be carried forward into the new bylaw. Hopefully that helps answer your question. Okay, any other questions from anyone who's been able to join us? We really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to join the conversation, and we're certainly here to continue the conversation. Well, we're not seeing any comments here, so we'll formally, conclude the meeting, as I said, but Chris and I will hang on for a couple minutes as we go forward. So thanks so much for joining us this afternoon.